This young man looks like he could be a Division I recruit. Maybe baseball, shortstop, steal a lot of bases, or a running back, or a point guard. Lean, agile, looks fast and strong. But his game? Lacrosse. The Dakota Sioux, like many American Indian tribes, Midwest to the east of the nation, loved lacrosse. And it was wild. Most of the time they didn't have any boundaries. A field could be anywhere from 500 yards to 6 miles long. They would play all day with only a slight intermission during the course of that day. And they would run probably 40 to 50 miles during that one day of lacrosse. Sometimes the games would go on for days and days, and it could get real rough. On occasion, somebody would get killed playing lacrosse. These pictures, including the drawing of the young man, were all made on July 23, 1851, while he was playing lacrosse somewhere near this area known as Reservation. But something much more important was happening nearby at that same location.
This is Traverse des Sioux, which is just north of present-day St. Peter, Minnesota. And this is the site of a treaty where the big steal really began.
In July of 1851, two of the bands of the Dakota Sioux, the Sissetons and the Wahpetons, met at Traverse des Sioux with U.S. government officials, and while the young men played lacrosse nearby, the chiefs entered into a treaty whereby the Dakota Sioux ceded all of their traditional lands to the U.S. government. That would be about 24 million acres in exchange for approximately $1,665,000, $305,000 of which was to be paid up front. That comes out to be about 7 cents per acre. The treaty also stated that the government would provide the Dakota Sioux with a reservation consisting of a strip of land 20 miles wide and 70 miles long in perpetuity. But there was a problem with the treaty. None of those things promised to the Dakota Sioux were true. $305,000 up front, that didn't go to the Dakota Sioux. That went to the traders who were making bogus claims against the Dakota Sioux. The rest of the money, the $1.3 million, that didn't go to the Dakota Sioux. That went into, quote, trust. And then interest that was accrued on that balance was paid to them, a meager sum compared to the $1.3 million. And finally, the reservation, supposed to be theirs forever, that was changed, and it turned out that the reservation was theirs only until the government decided to sell it to settlers. In short, the Dakota Sioux were robbed, swindled, cheated out of everything that was important to them, which was probably the plan from the beginning. And then it happened again.
Approximately 2 weeks after the first treaty at Traverse des Sioux, where the Sisseton and the Wahpeton bands signed away their land and agreed to live on a reservation, the two other bands, the Wapakudi and the Mindawakaton, signed a separate treaty here in this location.
It was called the Treaty of Mendota, and it was signed on some high ground sacred to the Dakota Sioux, known as Pilot Knob. This is the current view from Pilot Knob looking towards the city of Minneapolis. The area is now heavily wooded, but you can make out at least the top of Fort Snelling there across the Minnesota River. But for any of those chiefs at that treaty site in August of 1851 who might have had second thoughts about whether they should take on the United States government. All they had to do is look out across the Minnesota Valley and they would see Fort Snelling standing out like a sore thumb because it was on prairie land at that time, not covered by the woods. And the full might of the U.S. government military was plain for all to see. This second treaty, which, by the way, was signed by Little Crow on behalf of the Midwakatans, you remember him from last chapter, I hope, was pretty much a repeat swindle of the first treaty. The Wapakudi and Midwakatan tribes never received any of the $220,000 they were supposed to get up front. All went to the traders who, again, made bogus claims against the two bands. And the rest of the money, the $1,160,000, that they never saw either, for the same reasons as the first treaty. And of course, they thought the reservation they were going to be moving on to was going to be forever, and that wasn't true either. It was for as long as the government allowed them to live there. It was a cheat. It was a steal. In order to understand the scale of the land grab here, it's helpful to look at this map that shows the traditional Sioux territory and then the small strip of reservation that they were now going to have to live on. They gave up Badote, the center of their universe, and the big woods, all of it, and millions of acres of prairie land. The reservation itself was broken up into two different sections. The Sisseton and Wahpeton bands, they lived on the northern part of the reservation, and they had their own agency called the Upper Sioux Agency. We're overlooking the Minnesota River right now, near the present-day town of Granite Falls, and this is the approximate location where the Upper Sioux Agency was located. The agency would have consisted of a warehouse, some traders' stores, a schoolhouse, and quarters for people who worked at the agency, like warehouse people, a teacher, missionaries. The second agency, the Lower Sioux Agency, was used by the Midwakatan and Wapakudi bands, Wapakudi being Inkpaduta's band, or he was a member of that band.
This is the Lower Sioux Agency, close to the current town of Redwood Falls. Not much here right now. I don't believe there's a building that survived from the time when Abby would have come through here. There's one building that dates back to 1861, so it was a few years later. But this was an important part of what was going on in the 1850s. And you can probably tell that because the name is mentioned over and over again during the Abby story.
And finally, the government built a fort near the reservation, Fort Ridgely. Its function, maintain order on the reservation.
This is Fort Ridgely, or what's left of it. Primarily one building over my shoulder there, and then the foundations you can see of all the other buildings.
This fort was manned by about 76 men, infantry, and 2 officers. Did not have a palisade or a wall. It was just freestanding buildings. And this is something that 13-year-old Abby Gardner would have seen. She also passed through both the Upper Sioux Agency and the Lower Sioux Agency. She saw all of this. The 2 treaties of 1851 required that the Dakota Sioux move onto the reservation by 1853. And by November of that year, most of the Dakota were living on the reservation. So we come to a question. How is it that over the course of 28 years, from the time that Fort Snelling was completed until the time when the Dakota had to be living on that small reservation, that period of time between when Inkpaduta was 10 years old and 38 years old, how is it that the Dakota way of life was so completely decimated? There are a lot of things that come into play during those 28 years. Disease ravaged the Dakota Sioux in Minnesota and Iowa. In 1837, smallpox hit Inkpaduta's village of probably 40 lodges and 35 warriors. And when all was said and done, there were only 10 lodges left and 18 warriors remaining. Inkpaduta survived that and lived the rest of his life with extensive smallpox scars. Prior to the time that Fort Snelling was built, it was estimated that there were 25,000 Dakota Sioux in the state of Minnesota and northern Iowa. 28 years later, at about the time the treaties were signed in 1851, there were only 6,000 Dakota Sioux remaining. In 1839, 2 years after smallpox hit Inkpaduta's village, there were only about 325 Wapakotis remaining. This left fewer hunters to provide for the band, as well as fewer warriors to defend those people. And that was a problem because there were people who wanted to destroy the Dakota Sioux, and in particular the Wapakoti. Their traditional enemies, the Sac and the Fox, were just south in Iowa. Longtime enemies, the fighting between and among those tribes became worse as they competed for game, which was becoming more and more scarce with the influx of white settlers. In 1850, when there were 6,000 Dakota Sioux in Minnesota, there was an equal number of white settlers. By 1857, there were 150,000 whites in Minnesota. Same in Iowa. By 1854, there were 517,000 living in Iowa, mostly right along the Mississippi River. Game was becoming scarce, and you just didn't see herds of buffalo, herds of elk anymore. The Dakota Sioux were struggling as those 28 years went along, and at times they needed help, and they turned to the traders who extended credit to them. And then when it came time to pay the traders back, the traders cheated them by claiming that the Dakota Sioux owed them much more. And it went on and on. In fact, one of the main reasons that the Dakota Sioux signed those treaties is because it was the only way they had to repay the claims being made by the traders. The Dakota Sioux were cheated every step of the way, and their land and their way of life were taken from them. And they found themselves scratching the dirt and living in misery on that little reservation. And as far as Inkpaduta is concerned, he never once signed a treaty. He never lived on a reservation in Minnesota or the United States for that matter. And yet his life, his attempt to live the traditional way of life, led to misery, frustration, and not surprising, violence.